The first time Daniel heard the faint scratching at his front porch, he thought it was just the wind. It had been snowing heavily all afternoon, the kind of relentless winter storm that made everything feel eerie and still. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the old wooden fence outside his cabin. He was used to the sounds of the wilderness, branches creaking, ice shifting. But this was different. It was soft, weak, like something was pleading, frowning. Daniel set down his coffee and walked toward the door. The old floorboards creaked beneath his weight as he approached, his breath visible in the cold air seeping through the gaps. Then there was again a faint, desperate whimper. His chest tightened. Slowly, he unlatched the door and pulled it open just enough to peer outside. And what he saw made his heart nearly stop. A tiny, shivering puppy sat on his snow-covered porch, its frail body curled up against the cold. Snowflakes clung to its damp, matted fur, and its tiny ribs were visible beneath its thin coat. But what truly made Daniel's breath catch were its eyes, wide, glassy, filled with desperation. The puppy lifted one trembling paw, as if reaching out for help, its entire body quivering with exhaustion. Daniel didn't think, didn't hesitate. He swung the door open and dropped to his knees. Hey, it's okay, he murmured, reaching out carefully. The little pup let out a weak whimper, but didn't pull away. It was too tired, too cold. Daniel gently scooped the trembling creature into his arms, cradling its frail body against his chest. It was ice cold, too cold. He felt his pulse quicken as he rushed inside, kicking the door shut behind him. He needed to warm the puppy fast. Wrapping it in a thick blanket, he carried it toward the fireplace, his mind racing. Where had it come from? How had it survived out there alone? And most importantly, why had it come to him? Daniel had lived alone for years, deep in the woods where visitors were rare. But something about this little puppy, this tiny, frozen soul who had fought to reach his door, felt different. Like it hadn't stumbled here by accident, like it had chosen him. And as he gently wiped the frost from its fur, watching its tiny chest rise and fall in shallow breaths, Daniel knew this was just the beginning. The small cabin flickered with the golden glow of firelight as Daniel knelt beside the trembling puppy. Wrapped tightly in a thick fleece blanket, the tiny creature lay curled against the warmth of the hearth, its fragile body barely moving. Daniel pressed his palm gently against its chest, feeling the faint, erratic rhythm of its heartbeat. It was still alive, but just barely. Come on, little guy, he murmured, rubbing its tiny paws between his hands to get the blood flowing again. The puppy shuddered, letting out a weak whimper. Daniel's mind raced. Where had it come from? How long had it been out there in the brutal cold? There were no houses for miles, just endless stretches of snow-covered wilderness. A stray wouldn't have survived this storm alone. Then why was it here? Why his house? He glanced toward the door. It had barely scratched hard enough to be heard. It was a miracle he had even noticed. Or maybe it wasn't a miracle. Maybe the puppy had meant for him to hear. A deep unease settled in Daniel's chest. Something wasn't right. And then, just as the thought crossed his mind, the puppy stirred. It lifted its tiny head, its ears twitching, its glassy eyes, once dull with exhaustion, suddenly focused, sharp and urgent. Daniel froze. The puppy tried to stand. Its legs wobbled violently beneath it, but it fought, pushing through the pain. "What are you doing?" Daniel whispered, instinctively reaching out to steady it. But the moment his fingers touched its trembling body, the puppy flinched. Not from fear, from something else. A surge of panic, a desperate need to move. Then, it cried out, a high-pitched, frantic yelp. Daniel's stomach clenched. Something was terribly wrong. The puppy staggered away from the warmth of the fire, moving toward the door. Its tiny body swayed, every step a battle, but it didn't stop. It reached the wooden door, then turned, its wide, dark eyes locking onto Daniel's. "Come." The unspoken message was clear. Daniel swallowed hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. This wasn't just a lost, half-frozen pup. It hadn't come here by accident. It had come for help. His gut twisted. If the puppy had barely survived, what about whatever, or whoever, was still out there, Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, yanked on his boots, and threw open the door. The storm had settled, but the night was still brutally cold. Snow stretched out in every direction, the landscape ghostly under the glow of the moon. The puppy let out another small yelp and took a few shaky steps forward. It wanted him to follow. Daniel exhaled sharply, his breath a cloud of mist in the frigid air. "All right, little one, show me." He stepped into the snow, the puppy struggling alongside him. Every few feet, it stopped to glance back, making sure he was coming. Daniel's heart pounded harder with every step. Then about 20 yards from the cabin, the puppy suddenly stopped. It stood frozen, its tiny body quaking, its nose pointing toward the snow-covered trees ahead. Daniel followed its gaze and felt his blood run cold. Something was there, a shape barely visible against the snow, lying still beneath the shadow of a fallen tree. Daniel sprinted forward, the puppy stumbling after him. As he got closer, the outline became horrifyingly clear. A person, buried almost entirely in the snow. Daniel dropped to his knees, his hands flying to dig through the frozen layer covering the figure. The person was small, curled up in a fetal position. He brushed away the snow from their face. A child, a little girl, no older than 5 or 6. Her lips were blue, her tiny face pale and unmoving. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. "No, no, no," he breathed, shaking. He pressed 2 fingers against her neck. For one agonizing second, nothing. Then, a faint, flickering pulse. She was alive. Barely. Daniel wasted no time. He scooped her up, cradling her tiny, frozen body against his chest. The puppy let out a desperate whimper, circling his feet as he stood. This was why the puppy had come. Not for itself. For her. Daniel ran back toward the cabin as fast as he could, every instinct screaming that time was running out. Inside, the fire roared, filling the room with much-needed heat. Daniel carefully laid the little girl on the couch, grabbing every blanket he had to wrap around her fragile body. He worked fast, rubbing warmth back into her limbs, checking for injuries. The puppy jumped up beside her, pressing its small body against her, as if trying to share what little warmth it had. Daniel's mind reeled. How long had she been out there? Where had she come from? And how had this tiny, half-frozen puppy managed to find her, much less drag itself through the snowstorm to get help? The questions could wait. Right now, only one thing mattered: keeping her alive. The night was long. Daniel never left her side, watching for any sign of improvement. The puppy refused to leave either, curling up beside her, its tiny chest rising and falling in exhausted relief. Then, just before dawn, a tiny cough. Daniel's eyes snapped open. The little girl stirred. Her fingers twitched beneath the blankets. Her eyes fluttered, then slowly, miraculously, opened. Daniel let out a choked breath. "Hey," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're okay. You're safe." The little girl blinked up at him, disoriented. Then, slowly, her eyes shifted to the puppy beside her. A soft, barely there whisper left her lips. "Bear." Daniel froze. She knew the puppy? The tiny dog let out a soft whine, inching closer, pressing its nose against her cheek. And then, the little girl broke into quiet sobs, her frail arms wrapping around the puppy as she buried her face in its fur. Daniel swallowed hard. Whatever had happened, wherever she had come from, this puppy had saved her. And now, Daniel needed to find out why. The little girl clung to the puppy as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. Her frail body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something more terrifying than the brutal winter she had just escaped. Daniel sat beside her on the couch, watching closely as she buried her face in the tiny dog's fur, her small fingers gripping it desperately. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently. "You're safe now. You're warm. No one's going to hurt you." She didn't respond. The puppy, whom she had called Bear, let out a low whimper and pressed against her protectively. Daniel's mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why was she out there alone in the middle of a snowstorm? Daniel ran a hand down his face, trying to think. The storm had been merciless. No one should have survived out there. let alone a child and a puppy. And yet, here they were. Something wasn't adding up. He needed answers. After an hour, the girl finally stopped shivering. Daniel offered her warm tea and some soft bread, which she nibbled at cautiously. She hadn't spoken since that single whispered word. Bear. He decided to try again. What's your name, sweetheart? Silence. She didn't look up. Bear let out a soft whine and pawed at her arm. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her gaze toward Daniel. Lily, she finally murmured. Daniel exhaled in relief. Progress. That's a beautiful name, Lily, he said gently. Can you tell me where you came from? Where your parents are? The moment the words left his mouth, her small body went rigid. Her fingers tightened around Bear's fur. A shadow crossed her expression, one that sent an icy chill down Daniel's spine. Lily, he prompted softly. Her eyes darted toward the door, as if afraid someone might come bursting in. And then, they're gone, she whispered. Daniel's breath caught. Gone, he echoed. Gone where? Lily swallowed hard. Her lips trembled as her gaze flickered between Daniel and Bear. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the bad man took them. Daniel's chest tightened. What do you mean, sweetheart? What bad man? Lily shook her head frantically, gripping Bear even tighter. I don't know, she whimpered. He came to the house. Mommy told me to hide in the closet. She said not to make sound, no matter what. Her voice cracked. I heard screaming. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Lily's small hands were shaking now. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Then it got really quiet, she continued, her voice barely audible. I stayed in the closet for a long time. I waited for Mommy to come get me, but she never did. Daniel swallowed the lump rising in his throat. Lily wiped her nose with the back of her sleeve. Then Bear found me, she whispered. Daniel's gaze snapped to the tiny puppy. Bear found her. Lily hesitated, then continued. He started barking at me, but I was too scared to move. I didn't know if the bad man was still there. Daniel listened carefully, his heart pounding. Then Bear started pulling on my sleeve, Lily said, glancing down at the little dog. Like he was telling me to go, but I was scared. Her voice wavered. But then I heard footsteps. Daniel stiffened. Lily's fingers curled into a fist. They were coming up the stairs, she whispered. Bear started growling. He never growls. Daniel didn't dare breathe. Lily's voice became shakier. I heard the closet door creak just a little. Then Bear lunged at it. He barked so loud, louder than ever before. The footsteps stopped. Daniel's entire body tensed. Then, Lily hesitated. They ran away. The weight of her words hit Daniel like a hammer. This puppy, this tiny, half-frozen creature, had chased away a threat that Lily's own mother had been powerless against. The realization made his skin prickle. Lily, he said carefully, did you ever see the bad man's face? She shook her head quickly. I only saw his boots, she whispered. Daniel clenched his jaw. After he left, Bear kept pulling on my sleeve. Lily continued. He wouldn't stop. He wanted me to leave the house. Her small hands trembled. I didn't want to, she admitted. I was scared. But Bear wouldn't stop. He just kept pulling me, like he knew I had to go. Daniel's pulse pounded. This puppy had sensed danger, had saved her, had led her away before the bad man could come back. And somehow, in the middle of a deadly snowstorm, had brought her to him. Daniel sucked in a shaky breath. He had no idea where Lily's house was, no idea how far she had traveled. But one thing was clear. Someone dangerous was still out there. And if they had realized Lily had escaped, his stomach twisted. They might come looking for her. His protective instincts kicked in instantly. Lily, he said firmly, you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. But I need to ask you something, okay? She nodded hesitantly. Do you remember anything about where your house is? Lily hesitated, then slowly shook her head. It was dark, she whispered, and the snow was too high. I just followed Bear. Daniel's chest tightened. Bear had led her through the storm, not aimlessly, directly to him. Daniel reached down and stroked the little puppy's head. You're a special one, aren't you, buddy? He murmured. Bear looked up at him, his tiny tail wagging once. A knock sounded at the door. Daniel's blood turned to ice. Lily flinched violently, curling into herself. Bear let out a low, almost unnatural growl. Daniel placed a steady hand on Lily's back, his eyes locked on the door. He wasn't expecting anyone. And in a snowstorm like this, whoever was outside wasn't supposed to be here. He rose slowly, heart hammering, and reached for the shotgun mounted above the fireplace. Then, gripping the weapon tightly, he stepped toward the door. Outside, the wind howled, and through the frosted window, a shadow shifted. Daniel's fingers tightened around the shotgun as he approached the door, his pulse hammering in his ears. The shadow beyond the frosted glass shifted again, slow and deliberate. Behind him, Lily trembled, pressing herself against the couch. Bear stood in front of her, his tiny body rigid, ears flattened, lips curled in a low, threatening growl. Another knock. Harder this time. Think, Daniel. Think. The snowstorm had trapped most people inside. No one should be out here, not this late, not in this weather. Which meant whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't here by accident. Daniel inhaled slowly, bracing himself. Then, he threw open the door. The icy wind blasted into the cabin, nearly knocking the breath from his lungs. Snow whirled in thick flurries, but through it, Daniel saw a man, bundled in heavy winter gear, his hood pulled low, his face partially hidden by a thick scarf. But his eyes were sharp, searching. Daniel's grip on the shotgun tightened. "Can I help you?" The man hesitated, then took a step forward. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice low and oddly flat. "Got caught in the storm. I was hoping to take shelter." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink. Something about the man's presence felt wrong. Lily whimpered behind him. The man's eyes flicked past Daniel, toward the small girl huddled on the couch. Daniel saw the moment it happened. That split-second recognition in the stranger's eyes. He knew who she was. Daniel's body moved on instinct. He stepped forward, blocking the man's view of Lily entirely. "Storm's dying down," he said coldly. "Road's just a mile south. You'll find a gas station there." The man didn't leave, didn't even pretend to glance away. Instead, his lips curled ever so slightly. "You alone out here?" Daniel's stomach turned to lead. Every fiber of his being screamed at him. This wasn't just some lost traveler. This was the bad man. Daniel let out a slow, steady breath. "I think you should move along." The man's eyes flickered, calculating. Then, he lunged. Daniel barely had time to react. The stranger shoved forward, slamming into the door, trying to force his way inside. Daniel staggered back, but caught himself, slamming his shoulder into the doorframe to block him. Bear snapped. The tiny puppy launched forward, teeth bared, a ferocious snarl ripping from its throat. It sank its teeth into the man's boot, shaking violently. The man cursed and kicked out, sending Bear flying across the cabin. Lily screamed. Daniel saw red. With a roar, he swung the butt of the shotgun, slamming it into the man's jaw. The impact sent the stranger reeling backward. Daniel didn't wait, didn't hesitate. With all the force he had, he shoved him out into the snow and slammed the door shut. The cabin filled with Lily's sobs and the frantic scratching of Bear scrambling back to his feet. Outside, the man recovered fast. A heavy thud hit the door, then another. Daniel grabbed a chair and shoved it under the doorknob, barricading it. His mind raced. This wasn't over. The man was going to try again. And if he got in, Daniel wouldn't let himself finish the thought. He spun around. Lily was still crying, clinging to Bear, who, despite being thrown, was already back on his feet, growling fiercely at the door. Daniel knelt, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Lily," he said urgently, "listen to me. We have to get out of here. Now." She sniffled but nodded, her small fingers tightening around Bear's fur. Daniel moved fast. He grabbed his emergency pack, extra blankets, supplies, his revolver, and turned to Lily. "Can you walk?" She nodded again. "Good girl. Stay close to me." He grabbed his coat, yanked it over Lily's tiny frame, and scooped her into his arms. Bear, refusing to be left behind, jumped up into the crook of her elbow. Outside, the man was still pounding on the door. Daniel didn't wait for him to get through. With one last deep breath, he turned toward the back door and slipped into the night. The storm had calmed, but the world was still bitterly cold. Snow crunched beneath Daniel's boots as he trudged through the thick drifts. Lily clutched tightly to his chest. Bear was alert in her arms, his little body tense. Daniel didn't stop, didn't look back. He knew the man would follow. They needed to reach town. Just as that thought crossed his mind, a gunshot rang out. Daniel's heart lurched. The echo bounced off the trees, too close. Lily whimpered, burying her face against his chest. Bear growled. Daniel moved faster, his breath ragged, eyes darting through the darkness. Then, a shadow moved in the trees ahead. He wasn't alone. They were being hunted. Daniel's mind spun. If he was caught, Lily wouldn't survive. And then, Bear barked. Loud, urgent. Daniel barely had time to react before the puppy jumped from Lily's arms. No! Lily sobbed. Bear, come back. But the puppy didn't stop. It turned and ran straight toward the shadow. Daniel's breath caught. It was distracting them, buying them time. A choked sound escaped Lily's throat. But Daniel didn't let the moment go to waste. He held her tight and ran. Daniel didn't stop running until he saw the faint, distant glow of headlights. Civilization. He pushed harder, his lungs burning, his legs screaming in protest. Finally, he stumbled onto the main road. A pair of headlights beamed toward him. Daniel threw up an arm, waving frantically. The car skidded to a stop. A man jumped out. What the hell? Daniel didn't have time to explain. Call the sheriff, he gasped. Now! Lily sobbed into his chest. The man's face paled. Without hesitation, he grabbed his radio. Sirens sounded in the distance. They were safe. But Bear. Daniel turned back toward the woods, his chest tight, his heart hammering. But there was nothing. Only snow. Only silence. The tiny, brave puppy was gone. Lily's cries broke through the night. Bear, she whispered. He saved us. Daniel's throat tightened. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. Then, as the first police car arrived, as officers swarmed to take their statements, a small, battered shadow emerged from the tree line. Bloodied, limping, but alive. Lily gasped. Bear! The little dog collapsed into her arms. And for the first time that night, Lily smiled. The world seemed to move in slow motion as Lily clutched Bear to her chest, her small fingers gripping his tiny, battered body. Snowflakes clung to his fur, matted with dirt and blood, but his little heart still beat. Weak, but steady. Lily sobbed into his fur, her entire body shaking with relief. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The sirens wailing in the distance grew closer, their red and blue lights flickering against the snow-covered trees. A sheriff's vehicle skidded to a stop beside them, and two officers rushed out. Sir, are you okay? One of them asked. Daniel barely heard him. His eyes were locked on Lily, on the way she held Bear as though she would never let go again. Sir, the officer placed a hand on his shoulder. You need medical attention? Daniel finally looked up, exhaustion weighing heavily on his body. No, he rasped. But she does. The officers turned to Lily, their expressions shifting from professional detachment to quiet concern. One of them knelt beside her, speaking softly. Sweetheart, are you hurt? Lily sniffled, shaking her head. But Daniel knew better. She had lost everything. Her home, her mother, the life she had once known. And yet, through it all, through the bitter cold, the fear, the horror of that night, one small creature had never left her side. Bear, the tiny puppy that had shielded her, guided her, and fought for her. The puppy that had saved her life. And in return, she had saved his. An hour later, they sat inside a small, warm police station, wrapped in blankets. The sheriff himself had come to take Daniel's statement, and as he spoke, recounting every terrifying moment, he kept glancing at Lily. She hadn't let go of Bear once. The little dog lay curled in her lap, utterly exhausted but safe. Alive. When Daniel finished speaking, the sheriff ran a hand down his face, exhaling heavily. We found a man's truck abandoned just outside of town, he said grimly. We've got a team out searching for him now. His jaw tightened. He won't get far. Daniel nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. Lily, what would happen to her now? She had no family that he knew of, no place to go. As if sensing his thoughts, the sheriff sighed. Social services will take her in, he said quietly. They'll find a home for her. Lily stiffened at the words. Daniel felt something ache deep in his chest. He glanced down at her, at the way she clung to Bear, her tiny face buried in his fur. She had lost so much already. He couldn't let her lose the one thing she had left. Not now. Not after everything. The words left his mouth before he had fully processed them. She can stay with me. The sheriff blinked. Lily's head snapped up. Daniel cleared his throat, steadying his voice. I mean it, he said firmly. I've got space. I can take care of her. The sheriff studied him for a long moment. You sure about this? Daniel looked down at Lily, at the little girl who had been through so much, at the puppy who had risked his life for her. And he knew there was no other choice. Yes, he said softly. I'm sure. For the first time since that night began, Lily's lips quivered into a small, hopeful smile. Daniel smiled back, and beside her, curled up in a ball of warmth and loyalty, Bear let out a soft, content sigh. He had found his home, just like she had, just like they all had. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, Lily slowly began to heal. She laughed more. She played. She started to sleep peacefully through the night. And through it all, Bear remained by her side. He was more than just a pet. He was her protector, her best friend, her family. Daniel often found himself marveling at the tiny dog, at his unwavering devotion, his unshakable spirit. How could something so small hold so much courage? The answer was simple. Love. Bear had loved Lily enough to risk everything for her. And in the end, that love had saved them both. The story of Lily and Bear spread through the town, touching the hearts of everyone who heard it. People donated food, clothes, and supplies. Some even offered to adopt Bear, but Lily never let him out of her sight. He was hers, and she was his. Daniel knew their journey wasn't over. There would be challenges, nightmares, wounds that would take time to fade. But one thing was certain. They had each other, and no matter what lay ahead, they would always have each other. Because sometimes, heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes, they have tiny paws, big hearts, and a love so strong it can change everything. Forever.